Since 2018, the NBA All-Star Game changed its format to where 2 captains are selected by fan voting, and those captains then go on to draft players from either conference. This made me wonder what the pre-draft analysis and comparison for each NBA All-Stars were, and who was drafted right before them. So in today's video and in the next one, I'll be going over Team LeBron's player and see to who they were compared pre-draft, as well as the weaknesses and strengths they were given by scouts. And in the next video, I'll be going over Team Giannis and look at which player was drafted right before every single player in his team and comparing their careers. For the pre-draft comparisons, I gathered all of them from NBADraft.net. Others might have other comparisons, but I chose to base them on that website. So for LeBron, his comparison was to Magic Johnson because of his strengths that were his passing ability and vision. And they kind of considered him as a tall point guard, just like Magic was. They said in LeBron that he would probably not play the point guard in the NBA because he had more of a small forward body. But the offense needed to go through him in order to be successful, which resembled Magic Johnson a lot. And what they considered some of his weaknesses was mostly due to his shooting, because his free throw shooting wasn't necessarily great. He was shooting below 70%. His defense was also a category that needed to be improved, but that could have been because he was playing high school and probably dominating everyone, so he didn't really care about defense. They also considered that all the hype around him could have been a weakness because no one ever had to deal with such a thing. But looking back at it right now, it's safe to say that he handled it pretty well, now that he's the all-time leading scorer with multiple titles and MVPs, and in the debate for who's the greatest basketball player of all time. While editing the video, I made the realization that since the draft happens right before the game, the replacement players have already been named, so the injured players that have been replaced, such as KD, were not drafted, so I will try to match a replacement player with an injured player and figure out under what team he should go, but it's not necessarily 100% accurate. Kyrie Irving was compared to players such as Mike Conley and Chris Paul coming out of Duke. He was considered a true point guard by scouts and was seen as a facilitator that could make those around him better with great vision and passing skills. And he was a good ball handler and a very efficient shooter for the short amount of time he played at Duke. This was also one of his weaknesses, was the fact that he only played 8 games as a freshman, so people were questioning his college experience and how it would reflect in the NBA. There were also questions as to whether his average athleticism would bother him in the NBA because he was not necessarily known to have highlight dunks and being all physical, but it's safe to say that those criticisms have been shut down because he doesn't need to dunk the ball to be an elite finisher at the rim, since he's known as probably the best finisher in NBA history. The comparisons are not necessarily true. He hasn't evolved into a true point guard. He's more of a scoring guard, but his playmaking decisions are not necessarily the best. But it hasn't bothered him in his career because he's one of the best scoring point guards we have seen in recent years. The next player probably had the best NBA comparison prior to the draft. He was compared to the likes of Tim Duncan and Hakeem Olajuwon, and this player is Joel Embiid. People saw him as a big center that loves to post up, but has also a soft touch and a good jumper. His defense was also a major part as to why those comparisons were made, but some of his weaknesses were that he was injury prone in college, which unfortunately led to him also missing time in the NBA early in his career, or because he was always in foul trouble. Another weakness of his was that he was not necessarily aware on offense and on defense, meaning that this would lead to a bunch of turnovers on the offensive end and him often getting caught ball watching on defense. Now that he has evolved and matured as a player, we can see that those comparisons are almost spot on and that Joel Embiid is in the realm of those legendary big men in NBA history. Coming out of Iowa State, Tyrese Haliburton was seen as a tall and rangy point guard with outstanding passing ability and court vision. His defense was also good in college, where he would average 2.4 steals per game, while also racking in 6 boards as a sophomore. But scouts saw that his jumper was pretty unorthodox, so they weren't sure his three-pointer or even mid-range would translate to the NBA at a decent rate. And since he was on the skinnier side, his defense was not necessarily expected to be similar as it was in college. So it led to comparisons of Lonzo Ball and Dante Exum, which were two recent tall point guards that had great court vision coming into the draft that were expected to make names for themselves in the NBA. So far in his third year, Tyrese Haliburton is already better than both of those guys by a lot. So he has exceeded expectations, but the initial comparisons weren't far from the type of player he would be. Jaylen Brown has grown into stardom despite being the probably second option for the Celtics behind Jason Tatum. And before he got drafted, he was compared to Jason Richardson and Jimmy Butler, who are both very great shooting guards in NBA history. Both of them were seen as great defenders and very athletic guards that could also play small forward if needed. Their ability to get to the line was a key similarity between all those players, but one of the weaknesses in Jaylen Brown's game was his shot selection, where he would often settle for jump shot more than he needed to, and was also inconsistent from range, which is something that Jimmy Butler was also known early in his career. Quick PSA, this video is recorded a week and a half before the All-Star game actually happens. I want the video to be out probably right between the draft and the game, depending on when the draft ends, or after the game. So I won't take into consideration the players that are injured. So I'll be going over KD. Probably, as of right now, Jaylen Brown just got hurt yesterday. So I don't know if he'll be at the All-Star game or not, but I won't go over the replacement players. DeMar DeRozan was drafted right after Lakers legend Jordan Hill. Hill hasn't played since the 2016-2017 season for a total of only 409 career games, with career averages of 7.9 points, 5.8 rebounds, and 0.8 assists. He was a pretty decent backup center in his career, but the fact that he was drafted in the top 10 for his draft makes it bad. Especially considering the fact that the guy drafted right after him has played over 1,000 games and is still playing today. He has career averages of 21 points, 4.4 rebounds, and 3.9 assists. And he's a 6-time All-Star as of this year. The next All-Star is probably one that I am uncertain as to whether or not is player comparison before the draft somewhat right or totally wrong, because I haven't watched him play a lot other than highlights that show up on Instagram. And the player comparison are older players that I got to see, one that I got to see plays at a certain extent, and the other one I know by name, I think, but I don't know his playstyle. And this player is Julius Randle. He was compared to David Lee and Billy Owens, and some of his strengths were that he was a very strong forward with good finishing abilities at the rim. Coming into the draft, he also had offensive skills that would help him make an immediate impact in the NBA, according to scouts. But on the downside, it was kind of short for a power forward, but too big for a small forward in terms of weight. His playstyle needed the ball to back down players, but they didn't believe that it would be possible in the NBA because players are much stronger than what he was facing in college. But so far, he has proven that he can still dominate. It took him quite some time early on in his career, but since he got the groove of it and the opportunity, he's been balling out. One main issue I personally have from the game I saw is that he often shoots his team out of games. He has that Dion Waiters mentality where even if you're shooting 1 for 9, you should keep shooting because if you stop, it means you lost your confidence. But for Julius Randle shooting as many threes and bad shots as he's shooting, maybe you should stop and reconsider that option. Next up is probably one of my favorite players, and this player is Luka Doncic. Before coming into the NBA, people didn't know what to expect from him as he was playing in Europe. So this led to comparisons to Toni Kukoc and Ido Turkoglu, which are both tall, white, European forwards with great passing skill and good shooting abilities. And these were also some of the most brought up strengths of Luka before the draft. On the other hand, for his weakness, people consider him as a very average athlete for an NBA player. He was often targeted in pick and roll situations due to his lack of defense, and it was thought that his ISO capabilities would be easily stopped in the NBA, or they were big questions as to whether or not they would be as great in the NBA as they were in Europe. And so far, he has shattered all of those expectations. Other than defense, there's barely any flaws to his game. He can finish through contact despite not being a great athlete. The only notch to his game other than his defense is how much he needs the ball in his hands to create, but that's mainly because the Mavericks never had a secondary scorer or ball handler or playmaker before Kyrie arrived, so we'll have to see for the rest of the season how those two play together. But I expect Luka to have his usage rate maybe lowered a bit and his catch and shoot opportunities take a slight jump. The next player is the most recent back-to-back MVP in Nikola Jokic. Before the draft, he was compared to Nikola Vucevic. We're both not very athletic big men coming out of Europe. They could shoot the ball at a decent rate for their size, and they both used their IQ to make up for their lack of athleticism. Due to his lack of athleticism, people were skeptical that Jokic could defend at the NBA level, which they were right. He kind of still struggles to do so, but it is far to be a problem that people care right now due to his elite presence on the court. On the other end, next up is the player that revolutionized modern day basketball, and this guy is Steph Curry. Since he came into the league with such a rare skill set and that he impacted the game so much by bringing the three-pointer, his comparison was not necessarily expected to be on point, but surprisingly they compared it to Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. Sorry if I say that wrong. But this guy was Steph Curry before Steph Curry, according to many people and according to the video I've been seeing of him. He was shooting the three before it was a popular thing to do back then. And for Steph Curry, we all know he was seen as a great shooter, great playmaker, somewhat good defender in terms of getting steals, but not locking down players. But he was very small, not that athletic, lacked on the defense in terms of getting around screens and playing one-on-one defense. So people didn't expect him to be the player he turned out to be. But with the evolution of the three-point line, mainly due to his game, he has shown that he is by far one of the greatest players in NBA history. But his comparison and analysis were on point and are still on point. Despite that, Mahmoud is not the player that Steph is, but Steph is, if we could say that, the evolution of Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf's game, because of how Abdul-Rauf was playing before it became popular, and Steph only took it to another level. Next up is Paul George, who was compared before the draft to Scottie Pippen, which surprisingly is very on point, as he's known as one of the best two-way players the game had. But coming out of college, I don't think people expected him to be such a good scorer. They expected him to be more of a great defender with some sort of offensive skills, because he was not necessarily the best ball handler, as it was stated in his weakness. He was not considered to have the ability to create for himself, and was shooting poorly off the dribble, which is surprisingly what he's known to do right now for the Clippers. But that comparison is probably one of the best I've seen while filming this video. The next player was in the middle of controversy earlier in the season when it was brought up that his stats at home were way higher than away, because the guy taking care of the stats was very generous towards him, and this guy is Jaren Jackson Jr. Before the draft, he was compared to Jermaine O'Neal, who is a very good offensive big man that could still shoot the ball, post up, good defender, could move at a decent level, but on the downside, he was not necessarily the best finisher at the rim. He was not able to shoot off the dribble. He was turning the ball over way more often than you would want from your big man, and his defensive aggressiveness would often lead to him having to come out of the game early due to foul trouble. But the comparison and the analysis in general is quite on point, looking at it 4 years into his career. And that's it for today's video, guys. As always, don't forget to drop a like and subscribe. You can also leave in the comments what are your thoughts on today's video. Does anything surprise you? Or you could also comment on what you thought of the All-Star Weekend. That being said, thanks for watching and have a great one.